G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. We're going to talk about non-genetic evolution and why fat people are so fat. And I suppose that'll annoy some people. Consider it insulting. But you got to admit, in the last 40, 50 years, the number of fat people getting around has skyrocketed. It's blossomed. I remember when fat people were rare. And 45 years ago, I was a fat kid. Only reason I'm not actually a fat adult is because I was starved in early puberty. I didn't appreciate it much at the time, but I got shipped out to a couple of Catholic boarding schools when I was 11. I went to the first one and I was 7.5 stone. And the boarding school was going broke, so they served us very unpalatable food and not much of it. And they were big on football and running around. And the result was that 2 years later, after chasing off the march fly, 2 years later when I left, I'd grown a head in height and I was still 7.5 stone. So I could have been a lot fatter than I am. And my mother's always been overweight. Her mother was overweight. All my mother's siblings are or were overweight. 2 of them are deceased. So I think this new scientist article I'm going to read to you is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Non-genetic evolution. We're looking at the New Scientist that came out on February 28. Article starts on page 32. Headline, The Mother of All Problems, by Edward Archer, who says, "Don't blame gluttony or genes for obesity. It's our sedentary habits echoing down the generations." Which is fairly provocative, and it might be easy to dismiss if it wasn't for the fact that his profile says Edward Archer is a physiologist and obesity theorist at the Nutrition and Obesity Research Centre, so he does this for a living, University of Alabama at Birmingham, so he's surrounded by lots of fat people. This essay is based on his paper, quote, "The Childhood Obesity Epidemic as a Result of Non-Genetic Evolution," unquote, and that paper was published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings, volume 90, page 77. So he's got the runs on the board, does this Edward Archer. And here's what he has to say. How can skinny people still exist? If we live in an environment that promotes obesity, filled with fast food, sugary drinks, TVs and cars, why isn't everyone obese? And if our genes cause us to be fat, why has the search for, quote, obesity genes, unquote, failed? For me, the quest to answer these questions began when I was a student working in labs with genetically identical mice eating genetically identical food. Surprisingly, the mice differed greatly in size. What caused the differences if it wasn't their diets or DNA? As I moved between labs, I noticed that pregnant mice without access to exercise wheels produced offspring that would themselves have larger, fatter offspring. While the first and second generations weren't much larger, subsequent generations certainly were. To me, this was an amazing observation. The activity levels of grandmothers and mothers during pregnancy determined the fatness of future generations. But was my observation correct? And if so, what were the mechanisms? I wasn't the first to observe this trend. Half a century earlier, the geneticist D.S. Faulkner had found that by breeding only the largest offspring of genetically identical mice eating identical diets, it was possible to produce progressively larger and fatter offspring over several generations. This finding supported my intuition that genes and food are not sufficient explanations of obesity. Despite the recent fanfare over the identification of a suite of genes associated with obesity, they explain less than 2% of the variation in obesity between individuals. This leaves the other 98%, known as the missing heritability, still to be discovered. When I began my own experiments to find the missing heritability, I found further evidence that calorie intake doesn't explain obesity. Active mothers and their leaner offspring ate more food and calories than the fatter inactive mice. Once again, I wasn't the first to discover this. In the 1950s, nutrition scientist Jean Mayer demonstrated that active animals, whether mice, rats, or humans, ate more food and stayed leaner and healthier than sedentary ones. By 2014, I had conducted an extensive literature review that turned my intuition into a theory that revealed the missing heritability and a new way of understanding why so many children today are obese. The answer was a combination of mother's body composition and physical activity during pregnancy. When pregnant women are physically active, the increased energy demands redirect nutrients to her muscles and away from her fetus. This competition between the mother's muscles and the developing fetus's fat cells produces leaner, healthier babies. Their genes and food intake are irrelevant to the process. This competition doesn't happen in inactive mothers. Without having to struggle for energy and nutrients, the fat cells in the fetus increase in both size and number, increasing the birth weight of the infant, a factor strongly related to adult obesity and type 2 diabetes. This is passed on down the line, with future generations becoming fatter and increasingly inactive and unhealthy. This is an example of non-genetic evolution, where traits are transmitted to offspring with no underlying change in their genome. This process helps to explain mine and Faulkner's observations in mice, while demonstrating the power of the uterine environment to permanently shape the metabolic processes that predispose some fetuses to obesity and metabolic disease. As it turned out, the idea that the uterine environment affects the fetus is commonplace in evolutionary biology and has been observed across many species. Known as, quote, accumulative maternal effects, it describes how a mother's age, size, fat stores, and behaviour, including physical activity, affect not only her health and metabolism, but also that of future generations. Humans are no exception. For instance, a 1995 study of babies born through egg donation found that the only discernible factor influencing their birth weight was the surrogate mother's body mass. The egg donor's body mass, her own birth weight, and the birth weight of her other children bore no relationship to the birth weight of the infant produced from the donated egg. That's from Early Human Development, Volume 42, page 29. The genes from the egg donor's biological mother played no detectable role in the weight of the infant. This helps to explain why, despite many billions of research dollars, the search for the, quote, genes that make us fat, unquote, will continue to disappoint. It said that in the Journal of Physiology, volume 592, page 2381. The idea that the 9 months we spend in the womb affects our health has been around for centuries. It was discussed by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, for example. More recently, the, quote, thrifty phenotype, unquote, hypothesis developed in the 1990s found an impoverished uterine environment can program a fetus's metabolism, predisposing it to obesity and diabetes. However, this doesn't explain why childhood and adult obesity exploded during the late 1970s when food was abundant. This is where my theory transforms our understanding of childhood obesity. For most of human history, survival required huge amounts of physical exertion. Hunting, gathering, chopping wood, and carrying water provided a dose of physical activity that made deliberate exercise unnecessary. Yet, over the past century, socio-environmental changes slowly eliminated physical labour. At first, technological advances coupled with a healthier food supply led to the birth of children that were the fittest in human history. But by the middle of the 20th century, the advent of labour-saving devices, the rising popularity of the car, and passive sedentary entertainment led to people becoming fatter and more inactive. From 1965 to 2010, the amount of energy expended in the home by women in the US decreased by almost 2,000 kilocalories per week. At the same time, the amount of time they spent watching TV and using computers doubled. It said that in PLOS 1, Volume 8, E56620. My research has found that obese women in the US get less than 1 hour of vigorous physical activity per year. Not surprisingly, just as non-exercising mice produce grandchildren that are bigger and fatter, so too do US women. By the late 1970s, a tipping point was reached in which mothers were so inactive that the evolution of human energy metabolism was markedly altered. As a result, fetuses grew so large that the need for caesarean sections rose significantly. The increased use of surgical interventions during pregnancy allowed both the larger babies and the mothers that produced them to survive and reproduce. Thus, natural selection was rendered artificial selection, and the number of metabolically compromised children and adults increased in the global population. Non-genetic evolution is the primary determinant of obesity, not gluttony, not fast food, not genes. The best solution to the obesity epidemic is to encourage would-be mothers to increase their levels of physical activity so that they can prepare their metabolism for pregnancy and have leaner, healthier children as a result. So, thank you, Edward Archer. Right, so there you go. Now you know. You see some poor individual staggering up the street, weigh about 3 times what a normal adult would weigh under other circumstances. It's not because they eat their head off. It's not because they choose to sit on their bum and do nothing. It's because their grandmother and their mother didn't get much exercise when they were pregnant. And it is a community-wide phenomenon among the industrialised high technology West, I guess. You know, that bloke got his timing right from the mid-1970s onwards. And when something happens to interrupt the supply of caesarean operations, whether that's a lack of doctors after an Ebola outbreak or whether it's lack of antibiotics for the infection risks or anything like that, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have very great difficulty breeding because of cephalopelvic disproportion. Interesting, isn't it? So for all that, physics is still physics, and I think if you can organise it to try and spend about as much energy in maintaining your day-to-day lifestyle, maybe getting around on the forest floor, collecting firewood, collecting your rainwater in tanks, which are plumbed to have the rain run into them, but they require buckets for the water to be hand carried out of them so it can be shared with the kangaroos. And if you've been born and bred to be overweight, living like a hillbilly and chopping your own firewood's probably a pretty good idea too. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.